Okay, today we're going to do something a little bit different. We are going to do a show on the need to rebel oppositional minds. So, some people seem wired to push parents, teachers, peers, bosses, spouses, rules, religion, and even common sense. It's not just stubbornness, it's a deeper, more persistent pattern of challenging authority and rejecting expectations, often in ways that disrupt their lives and in relationships. Today, we're going to look at the psychology and science behind that resistance, where it comes from, what it means, and what can be done to manage it. So, first, we're going to start with the clinical name for this behavior in children and adolescents, which is oppositional defiant disorder, or ODD. It typically begins before the age of 8, but almost always shows up before early adolescence. Kids with ODD aren't just having a bad day, they regularly lose their temper, argue with adults, refuse to follow rules, deliberately annoy people, and blame others for their mistakes. They can be touchy, spiteful, and angry, not once in a while, but often. The people with ODD need to stand out and be noticed. When these behaviors continue into adulthood or go undiagnosed, they can evolve into what's called persistent oppositional behavior, or sometimes pathological defiance. It may also show up as a reactance, which is a psychological resistance to being told what to do. Now, adults with these traits might always take the opposite stance in a conversation, feel attacked by feedback, reject advice even if it helps them, or constantly defy systems like the workplace, the law, or social norms just to prove a point. Another defining trait, especially in adults, is the need to force their reasoning or worldview onto others. They don't just want to be heard, they want to be obeyed. They'll argue their point endlessly, interrupt conversations, twist logic, or repeat themselves until others give in, not out of agreement, but out of sheer exhaustion. And despite demanding to be understood or followed, they rarely offer respect in return. It's not about mutual understanding, it's about control. They want you to listen, accept, and comply, but they don't want to hear your side. They'll push you to do things their way, and if you don't, they react with anger, withdrawal, blame, or even guilt tripping. This dynamic creates a one-way street where their opinions dominate and yours gets erased. There's another layer to this. People who behave similarly on the surface, but with a very motive. These are the contrarians. They also resist, argue, and challenge, but not always because they believe in what they're saying. In fact, many times they don't. They do it to stir the pot, to get attention, or to feel powerful in the room. Contrarians will often take the opposite stance just to disrupt the flow or draw focus to themselves. It's not about strong personal values, it's about performance. They thrive on the reaction, the want to sound smarter, seem different, or keep others on edge. Some do it out of narcissism, and most of the time they hate that word. Others do it from insecurity. But unlike people with true oppositional defiance, who often feel trapped in a survival route, the contrarian does it more consciously. It's a tactic, not a reflex. What ties the two together is the underlying power struggle. Whether it's the emotionally reactive person who must control every decision, or the performative contrarian who must control the conversation. Both types resist vulnerability and mutual respect. They aren't just disagreeing, they are dominating. They leave others drained, frustrated, and unsure of what's real. Now, often you'll find this type of behavior following along because it can happen with oppositional types, but it can also happen with contrarians. That definitely fits under the contrarian or performative activist type. These are the people who turn every issue into a battlefield, not out of passion, but out of habit. One week it's gender rights, the next it's environmental outrage, the next it's cancel culture. But it's not about helping. It's It's about arguing and being seen. They need a platform, a debate, a reason to make noise because being in opposition is their identity. And most of the time, people are not close friends with these people just because of that. That's not real advocacy, guys. That's attention-seeking masked as moral righteousness. You can spot them because they never stick with one cause, and the moment something new becomes controversial, they're suddenly an expert on it. Loud, aggressive, and usually divisive. They don't want you to say their name, but they want to be noticed at the same time. The word narcissism gets thrown around a lot these days, sometimes carelessly, but if someone falls under that category or has strong narcissistic traits, they often show up in this same pattern. They'll argue just to be right. They'll contradict you not because they disagree, but because they need to be the smartest person in the room. They demand validation, but rarely give it, and if they're challenged, they either blow up or shut down completely, punishing you with silence or blame. In some cases, what looks like ODD or contrarianism may actually be a form of covert narcissism. These individuals resist vulnerability, twist logic, and push their worldview on others, not out of confusion, but out of a deep need to maintain control and superiority. The behavior might look the same on the outside, but the root is different and much harder to reach. So now we're going to go on to the causes and development and roots of this. The origins of oppositional and contrarian behavior are rarely simple, and they never arise from a single source. Several factors blend together to create the patterns seen later in life. Genetics forms, one of the strongest foundations, but many individuals with oppositional traits have close relatives who struggle with mood disorders, ADHD, impulse control issues, or other behavioral conditions. A genetic predisposition sets the stage for emotional intensities, sensitivity to perceive criticism, and difficulties with self-regulation. Neurological differences also contribute heavily to oppositional tendencies. Studies involving brain imaging show variations in the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, the regions responsible for emotional regulation, decision-making, impulse control, and threat assessment. These individuals often interpret correction, guidance, or boundaries as personal attacks. Rarely do they notice that they are the ones that are the attackers. Their nervous systems react faster, stronger, and with far more intensity than those of neurotypical individuals. A request that feels neutral to most people can feel like domination or humiliation to them, which triggers resistance or escalation. Parenting environment further shapes the development of ODD. Inconsistent discipline, unpredictable consequences, emotional neglect, rigid authoritarian control, or chaotic home structures all influence how a child learns to interact with authority. Children raised in fear often adopt resistance as a shield. Children raised without boundaries often test limits until they reach extremes. Children raised in unpredictable chaos sometimes learn to control the only thing they can, their defiance. These patterns build slowly, but once they become habits, they often follow the child into adulthood. Trauma sits at the center of many chronic oppositional behaviors. A child who experiences abuse, instability, abandonment, or prolonged exposure to emotional volatility frequently develop behavioral defenses to survive. Defiance becomes protection. Control becomes safety. Arguments become a shield. The oppositional stance is not merely a behavioral choice in these cases. It becomes the individual's primary survival strategy in an environment that punished vulnerability. Contrarian development follows a different path. The contrarian rarely emerges from neurological dysregulation. Contrarian often develops from insecurity, a need for attention, a desire for superiority, or learned reward from confrontation. Individuals who discover that disagreement earns attention may learn to lean into it. Individuals who feel inferior may use contrarianism to feel intelligent or powerful. Individuals who enjoy the spotlight may use resistance as a stage. These patterns rely on performance rather than emotional overwhelm, which makes them easier to control in public and more strategic in private. Oppositional individuals and contrarians share similar outward behaviors, yet the psychological roots diverge dramatically. The oppositional person reacts, the contrarian calculates. The oppositional person defies because the world feels threatening or controlling. The contrarian defies because the world is perceived as a stage, and conflict is the fastest way to claim it. Now we're going to deal with the symptoms and the impact on the others. Oppositional defiant disorder presents a clear and identifiable pattern when examined through a clinical lens. Individuals with ODD display frequent temper loss, chronic irritability, and constant conflict with authority figures. Their behavior includes arguing with parents, teachers, or supervisors, refusing to follow rules, deliberately provoking or annoying others, and blaming everyone but themselves for their behavior. Their emotional environment surrounding them often feels tense and unpredictable because the smallest correction can erupt into a power struggle. These individuals frequently show resentment and hostility, and their reactions are disproportionate to the situation at hand. They thrive on conflict even when the conflict damages the relationships they depend on. They do not simply dislike being told what to do. They experience it as an intolerable threat to their sense of control. Their emotional reactions are intense, fast-moving, and difficult for them to regulate. Contrarian behavior shows a very different psychological structure, even though the surface looks similar. The contrarian thrives on opposition not because emotional overwhelm forces it, but because disagreement grants attention, stimulation, and a temporary sense of power. The contrarian often contradicts statements they privately agree with. Their arguments frequently lack genuine conviction, and their positions may change the moment the room shifts. They challenge statements to control the conversation rather than to defend a principle. Their interruptions, commentary, and verbal detours serve a single purpose: to dominate the social atmosphere. Their tone often remains smug or calm, while others grow frustrated or defensive, and this emotional contrast fuels their sense of superiority. The contrarian needs an audience, not a resolution. They feed off reaction, conflict, and the attention generated through disruption. The impact on those who live with oppositional or contrarian individuals is profound. Emotional exhaustion develops quickly because the environment requires constant vigilance. People learn to anticipate the next argument, the next contradiction, or the next emotional eruption. Daily functioning becomes centered around avoiding conflict, managing tension, or choosing silence over authenticity. Self-doubt grows steadily because oppositional and contrarian individuals challenge memories, perceptions, and emotional experiences so frequently that the people around them eventually question their own reality. A fog of confusion develops when repeated interactions distort conversations, escalate simple disagreements, and reframe accountability onto anyone but the oppositional or contrarian person. The nervous system adapts to chronic stress. Hypervigilance becomes a daily state. Individuals living with someone like this begin scanning for tone changes, subtle cues, or shifts in facial expressions. They prepare mentally for emotional upheaval, even during calm moments. Confidence begins to erode because every opinion is challenged. Every stinking decision is second-guessed, and every feeling is dismissed or minimized. People shrink inside their own lives, expressing less and suppressing more. Silence becomes a survival strategy rather than a preference. Emotional resentment grows steadily because the relationship becomes one-sided, draining, and chronically invalidating. The longer the pattern continues, the harder it becomes to see life outside of it. Cassandra syndrome frequently emerges in these environments. Cassandra syndrome describes the emotional devastation experienced when someone clearly sees the dysfunction, expresses it openly, and still finds themselves dismissed, ignored, or disbelieved. These individuals speak the truth, yet no one validates it. Family members minimize the behavior. Friends think the issues are exaggerated. Outsiders see only the charming, articulate, or socially competent side of the oppositional or contrarian person. The individual trapped inside the relationship becomes isolated in their own experience. A growing sense of invisibility forms because speaking the truth brings no support and no recognition. Cassandra syndrome creates a psychological loneliness that can deepen into anxiety, depression, and long-term emotional trauma. The person begins to question their own instincts because no one else sees what they see. The dynamic becomes a form of psychological abuse, not through violence, but through erosion of one's perception of reality. Living with someone with oppositional or contrarian fundamentality alters a person's internal world. Their sense of safety, confidence, voice, and emotional stability becomes compromised. The gradual decline is often invisible until the damage is already deep. Once the effects take root, recovery requires space, validation, and the rebuilding of personal authority. Emotional clarity returns only when the individual recognizes that the problem was the behavior they endured, not their response to it. Now let's talk about treatment, accountability, and closing. Once you recognize these patterns in oppositional behavior and contrarian performance, the next question is obvious. What can be done about it? ODD is not a personality quirk. It is a recognized clinical condition with a criteria laid out in the DSM-5 under disruptive impulse control and conduct disorders. Children who meet that threshold are not just difficult, they need structured help. The most effective approaches are not lectures or punishments. The most effective approaches are therapies that retain reactions, rebuild emotional regulation, and reshape the relationship between the child and the adults around them. Cognitive behavioral therapy can help children with ODD recognize triggers, slow down impulsive reactions, and learn different ways to respond when they feel controlled or criticized. Parent-child interaction therapy gives parents specific tools for handling defiance without feeding the emotional fire. Consistent boundaries, calm enforcement, and clear consequences create a structure that the oppositional child never had. Family therapy, well, that can rebuild damaged dynamics where every interaction has turned into a battlefield. Medication is sometimes used when ODD shows up alongside ADHD, anxiety, or mood disorders. Stimulants, antidepressants, or mood stabilizers are not cures for defiance. They reduce the intensity of the symptoms that amplify the problem, such as severe impulsivity or chronic agitation. Treatment only works when adults commit to long-term consistency rather than expecting a quick fix. Adult oppositional behavior is harder to shift because the pattern has had years to settle in and justify itself. Many adults with these traits believe the issue lies entirely with everyone else. Therapy for them, well, that focuses on accountability, emotional regulation, and challenging the stories they tell themselves, yes, in their heads, about control and respect. Cognitive behavioral therapy and dialectical behavior therapy can help them learn to tolerate discomfort without exploding or manipulating. Success depends heavily on their willingness to admit that their behavior damages relationships. In cases where the behavior overlaps with narcissistic traits, progress often moves slowly because the person protects their ego at all costs. They resist vulnerability, deflect responsibility, and use blame as a shield. Change is possible, yet it requires confronting the fact that their need to dominate has a fucking cost. Contrarians occupy an even more uncomfortable space because many of them do not experience themselves as having a problem at all. They develop an identity around being the one who challenges, exposes, or pushes back. Focused on therapy for the contrarian is less about emotional regulation and more about confronting motive. They have to ask themselves why they need to oppose everything and why they cannot sit in a room without turning it into a stage. Emotional growth for them involves learning to value connection over control and depth over performance. Self-awareness is the first step. Genuine humility is the second. The cultural layer makes everything worse. Diagnosis and labels have become social currency. People announce their ADHD, anxiety, ODD, trauma, and every other condition publicly and repeatedly. On one level, that visibility reduces shame and encourages people to get help. On the other level, it becomes a shield. Some individuals announce their oppositional tendencies or their mental health labels as a way to excuse chronic disrespect. They say, I have this disorder, so that is why I speak this way and that way. That is why I blow up. That is why I will not listen. The label becomes a license. That is not a treatment. That is entitlement dressed in clinical language. A diagnosis can explain behavior. It does not erase responsibility for the damage that their behavior causes. A similar problem appears in the sphere of public causes. Real activism grows from conviction and sustained effort. Performative activism grows from the need to be seen. The contrarian or performative activist finds a new issue to fight for every week, not because they are deeply invested, but because they require a fresh battlefield. One week it is one social cause, the next week it shifts to another. Then it becomes cancel culture, then environmental outrage, then something else is trending. The pattern stays the same. They need an argument, a spotlight, an audience. Being in opposition becomes their entire identity. They do not want their name mentioned in a way that might hold them accountable. Yet they demand to be noticed. This is not advocacy, that is theater. The people who live alongside these dynamics pay the price, believe me. Partners, parents, siblings, friends, and co-workers absorb the emotional fallout for years. They become exhausted, hypervigilant, and filled with self-doubt. Many develop Cassandra syndrome, as I mentioned before, where they see the problem clearly and speak it loud and still remain unheard or dismissed. It is something that, unfortunately, people suffer with. And healing for them begins with validation. They need their reality named and acknowledged. They need to hear that the problem is not their sensitivity, not their inability to let things go, but the constant drip of opposition and contradiction that has eroded their nervous systems. Recovery on both sides require honesty. The oppositional or contrarian person has to recognize that their pattern is not strength. It is not intelligence. It is not authenticity. It is compulsion, reaction, or performance. The people who have been orbiting these individuals have to recognize that their exhaustion is not weakness. It is the natural effect of living in a psychological storm for too long. Once both realities are placed on the table, choices become clearer. Some relationships can be salvaged through serious work, therapy, and new boundaries. Some relationships eventually have to end in order for either person to heal. Listeners who want to explore this further can turn to several reliable sources. As I mentioned earlier, the DSM-5 provides the official diagnostic criteria for oppositional defiant disorder and related conditions. The Mayo Clinic, the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, CHADD, which is CHADD, and the National Institute of Mental Health offer accessible explanations of symptoms, causes, and treatment options for ODD and coexisting disorders. Psychological reactants and contrarian behavior have been examined and researched on influence and decision-making. Books such as Influence the Psychology of Persuasion by Robert Cialdini, The Psychology of Judgment and Decision-Making by Scott Plous, The Narcissism Epidemic by Jean Twenge and W. Keith Campbell, and Emotional Vampirist, Dealing with People Who Drain You Dry by Albert Bernstein, dig into the mindsets behind control, resistance, narcissism, and the people who feed off conflict. Articles and essays on platforms like Psychology Today and Very Well Mind provide plain language discussions on narcissistic traits, toxic communication, and the emotional cost of difficult personalities. Academic work on psychological reactants can be found through Google Scholar for those who want the research backbone behind the patterns. The point of this conversation is not to hand people another label to weaponize. The point is to name what many of you have lived through and maybe never had the words for. Some people are oppositional because their brains and histories wire them to see every boundary as a threat. Some people are contrarian because attention, ego, and control mean more to them than connection. Neither pattern should run unchecked. Disorders explain behavior. They do not excuse cruelty. If you recognize yourself in the oppositional or contrarian descriptions, then this is your chance to take it seriously and seek real help instead of hiding behind labels. If you recognize someone you live with, then this is your reminder that your exhaustion is real and your perception is not broken. In a world that now rewards conflict, outrage, and constant calling out, it is easy to forget that cooperation is not weakness and that respect is not optional. The loudest voice in the room is not automatically the most honest or the most wounded. Sometimes it is simply the most oppositional. Sometimes it is the most addicted to attention. The real strength is in choosing not to play the game. The real strength is in holding your ground, telling the truth about what you see, and refusing to let someone else's need to rebel and rewrite your reality.
Origin Unexplained.